I want to start by thanking the university for inviting me and having me here, as I've found it is always best to start by thanking your hosts. That is, if you want to be invited back. Given that we are only a few days away from the 160-year anniversary of the Battle of Fort Sumter, and thus the opening of what's called the American Civil War, I think this is a great time to have a thoughtful and reflective discussion about this topic that is so heavily discussed and yet so deeply misunderstood. I'm also fond of saying that as an institution, Washington and Lee University is a very fitting expression of our nation's complicated history. After all, one of the people it's named after was a Virginian slave owner and prominent general who took up arms against his own country, effectively committing treason to fight for a cause the success of which would lead to the prolongment of the institution of slavery. And the other person is Robert E. Lee. My cheeky description of George Washington is, of course, based on the fact that the British Empire abolished slavery nearly 30 years before we Americans did. And thus, if we had remained loyal to the crown, slavery almost certainly would have been abolished here sooner. And so, not only do Robert E. Lee and George Washington share a number of relevant attributes and engaged in very similar behaviors for uncomfortably similar reasons, but the real-life effects of their efforts are also the same. They are both so-called traitors to their countries, leading a rebellious cause to form a new country that would prolong the institution of slavery. So why is one still a hero, and the other currently suffering from an all-out character assault and attempted wholesale cancellation? For all intents and purposes, Washington and Lee share virtually identical legacies in terms of their most defining traits and actions. In the annals of history, they're essentially the same person. So why the drastic difference? And here is where I kindly ask that you join me for what will be for many of you an unsettling and discomforting examination of the events surrounding what we call the American Civil War amidst the backdrop of U.S. history in its totality. I have no doubt that others up here on this stage will disagree or take issue with the points I will make this evening, and that's well and good. After all, that is why we are here. We've been invited to participate in a discussion about the causes and meaning of the Civil War and how the event fits into the broader context of the American story. I, for one, don't enjoy relitigating the specifics of the Civil War, and so I kindly ask for patience, even from those who do not take my position for their own, because I've deliberately left time in the second half of my remarks to make broader comments about our nation in general. I'm more interested in where we are going as a country as opposed to where we've been, though both are important. And so even if you find yourself rolling your eyes and biting your tongue, we might be able to find a modicum of agreement on the back end. I am not here to convert anyone. I only hope to cause people to think about this topic from a different perspective and in a broader context, and maybe even find a few new questions of their own. And no, I am not self-promoting a book for sale. In the academic world of publish or perish, it seems I've opted for the latter. I fully suspect that my position is not currently the popular one, but just because my argument is not popular at this time does not mean it is wrong. Just look at the advocates for the abolition of slavery here in the United States. Their position was not always popular either. And just because I am going to highlight facts that are inconvenient and often go ignored in today's society because they call into question the mythology we have concocted around the Civil War does not make those facts any less true. As they say, sometimes the truth just hurts. And the truth is that over the past several decades, we in academia and others in our society writ large have been manufacturing an embarrassingly oversimplified, feel-good fable about the Civil War that depicts the righteous prevailing over the wicked, built around a selective retelling of events as well as a deliberate forgetting of certain facts. It is a fable that includes both positive and negative exaggerations of both sides' chief players and even the rank and file. It is a very effective myth that has implanted itself firmly into our society, and it does what every good myth does. It helps us cope emotionally with a difficult topic by shielding us from uncomfortable realities. It gives us false heroes to praise, and more importantly, it gives us false villains to blame. My intent is to expose this fable, and the best way to do it is to start by saying some blunt words that might be jarring to the ears. The reality is this: the Civil War was not a war about slavery. The truth is, it could not have been only about slavery. In fact, it is illogical to assert that the Civil War was strictly or even mostly about slavery. After all, how can we earnestly state that a conflict between two sides was solely about the practice of slavery when both sides were actively practicing slavery within their own borders for the duration of the entire conflict? The slave states in the Union were Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri, for those of you keeping score. Of course, the Southern Confederacy had more slaves than the Union had, but if the Civil War really was truly about the issue of slavery, why didn't those Union slave states secede from the Union and join the Confederacy? Perhaps more critically, if the Union is fighting solely to abolish slavery, why didn't they invade those slave states and free their slaves? It's as though you witnessed a drunken brawl between 10 men. On one side, all 5 are smoking cigarettes, while on the other side, only 2 are smoking cigarettes. And then, after it was over, you concluded with absolute conviction that they must have been fighting strictly about the efficacy of cigarette smoking. One side was totally for it, and the other side totally against it. And that's why they were fighting, even though both sides had smokers the entire time. Wouldn't you laugh at such absurd reasoning? And so, you should laugh at the absurdity of the illogical mess of mental gymnastics and intellectual amnesia that has come to be mainstream teaching about the Civil War. I'm afraid I am far from finished, but at least I've given you fair warning. Not only are both sides of the conflict actively engaged in the practice of slavery, but the commander-in-chief of the Union, that's Abraham Lincoln, by the way, stated repeatedly that he had no desire to abolish slavery. He's kind of a big player in all of this, for the record, and he famously put in writing in response to respected abolitionist Horace Greeley and had it published in the newspaper in the year 1862, a full year after the Confederacy had seceded and in the midst of the war. His oft-forgotten words of total moral equivocation were, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." Heroic and principled indeed. And this is not to diminish Lincoln's nobler traits, just merely repeating the overlooked words of the commander-in-chief of the Union stating, for the record in the newspaper for all to know, that the Civil War was not about slavery. We also have to somehow contend with the fact that Union General Grant, the guy who eventually defeated the Confederacy and accepted Lee's surrender, himself owned slaves through his marriage to his wife. And there's even correspondence in 1863, in the thick of the Civil War, where he stated clearly and on the record that he had, quote, never been an abolitionist, not even what one would call anti-slavery. So, not only does the Union have slaves within its own borders, its main general for the conclusion of the war had slaves and held no personal opposition to the institution. And the revered president of the Union, the, quote, great emancipator, has made it abundantly clear that his motivations have absolutely nothing to do with slavery. I, for one, love the Emancipation Proclamation, but probably not for the reason most people do. I love that document authored by President Lincoln because it provides a rare opportunity for us academics to give an exact statistic on something. Does anyone care to guess how many slaves were actually actively freed by the Emancipation Proclamation? The exact number is 0. That's right. Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation has wonderful words in it, but does not actually free any slaves, even though he had the power and authority to free hundreds of thousands of slaves within his own borders, and he chose not to. Believe it or not, it gets worse. The 13th Amendment is understandably well known because it abolished slavery. However, what almost nobody talks about, and for obvious reasons, is that the 13th Amendment almost preserved and guaranteed slavery as a constitutional right. If you've dismissed my remarks this evening to this point, then I kindly ask that you tune in here. Shortly after Lincoln's inauguration as president and as the Southern states were beginning to make their departure from the Union, there was an earnest effort by a coalition of congressmen and senators to ratify a constitutional amendment which would make the practice of slavery a constitutional right in the states currently engaged in the institution. It passed both houses of Congress with supermajority support, and Lincoln indicated that he would sign the bill before it would then have to go to the states for ratification. Not only that, Lincoln even sent copies of this amendment to each of the state's governors and said on the record that he had no objection to its being made express and irrevocable. You won't find this mentioned in any American history textbooks, I assure you, and yet it is completely, damningly true. Just as I imagine a majority of the people gathered here this evening are also completely unaware of this horrendously uncomfortable truth. I am referring to, of course, the so-called Corwin Amendment, named after Congressman Thomas Corwin, who was not a pro-slavery Democrat from the South, but rather a Republican from the non-slave state of Ohio. All of this merely echoed Lincoln's sentiment that slavery as an institution was not to be tinkered with, a position that was made an official part of the Republican Party platform for the 1860 election in which Lincoln prevailed. 5 states ratified the Corwin Amendment, all of which were Union states, and 3 of which were free states that did not practice slavery within their borders. Now, this is the moment where we really slay the dragon on both sides of the ledger, so to speak. After all, this reality lays bare for all to see. Not only that Lincoln has no issue with slavery, he and his administration and even some anti-slavery Republicans were willing to codify into the Constitution the right to continue practicing slavery in the slave states in perpetuity. What does this say about the Union cause? Well, it makes it perfectly plain that the Union cause has nothing to do with abolishing slavery. How could it? They just voted to make it a constitutional right. As for Lincoln himself, the current mythology insists that he was hostile to slavery. Right, he was so hostile to the institution of slavery that as President of the United States, he did everything in his power to make it an inalienable constitutional right. But what does all this say about the Southern Confederacy's cause? If the Southern Confederacy is solely interested in the preservation of the practice of slavery, well, this is akin to handing them a blank check. If slavery is the only issue motivating them to secede and leave the Union, why on earth didn't they just take this complete and total political victory and stay put? It sure would have made their lives a heck of a lot easier. Now, I am well aware that human beings are perfectly capable of acting against their own self-interest from time to time. However, it is also a prevailing trend throughout history for groups of people to constantly take the course of least resistance. And in this instance, taking the course of least resistance involves the Southern slave states accepting this impending constitutional amendment and remaining in the Union. I mean, you may not admire the Southern Confederacy's leadership, but I think you'd have to concede that Jefferson Davis and his fellow Confederates were not lunatics that had just escaped from an asylum. They were rational, self-interested individuals. And as such, if they were only interested in preserving slavery, why go through so much needless effort in seceding from the Union when they've just been given everything they could possibly want? The myth pushers often talk about this whole argument that the South was fighting for states' rights as merely code word for slavery. But I have to ask, why would the South have been coy about anything after a certain point? I mean, they've already left the Union, formed a new government and army, fired upon federal troops, and are even printing their own money. If they were solely fighting for slavery, what are they holding back for? When they sing, hurrah, hurrah for Southern rights, hurrah, why don't they just sing out, for slavery always, we love slavery? It may seem a low-brow question, but I am sincere with my inquiry. Why all this coded language about separation of powers if their intentions were so one-dimensional and their separation already underway? The argument by the slavery-only mythologizers is something along the lines of, well, when Lincoln said the war was not about slavery, he really meant that the war was about slavery. When Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and other Confederate leaders all cited the secession of their home states and the mobilization of federal troops as the reasons for siding with the South, what they really meant was that they hate the African race. I mean, what they've done is just eliminate these people's own words that were entered on the record and then filled in the blanks with whatever narrative they're pushing. In addition to this devastatingly inconvenient observation from the lead-up to the Civil War, we also have to contend with one at the back end of the conflict. Here's another thing you won't find mentioned in any textbooks: Black Confederates. And it's not because they didn't exist, and there could have been a lot more. In the final 6 months or so of the Civil War, the upper echelons of the Confederacy genuinely discussed and deliberated over the prospect of wholesale freeing their slaves, arming them, and training them to fight in the Confederate Army. Robert E. Lee supported this idea, as did Judah Benjamin, who was a Jewish non-slave owning member of Jefferson Davis's cabinet. You won't hear much about him either, I assure you, because he doesn't serve the narrative that this myth propagates. Ultimately, the Confederacy did not wholesale adopt this strategy in the closing months of the war, which likely saved thousands of soon-to-be-freed slaves' lives. But this presents a pretty glaring question. If the Southern Confederacy's sole point of existing was for the preservation of slavery, why on earth would they even consider the prospect of freeing slaves, much less giving them guns? Surely they still recall John Brown's failed slave rebellion a mere 5 years prior. There's another group of people I'd like to mention at this juncture, the Native Americans. There has been a lot of recent interest and sympathy for the Native Americans and their place in American history, but that all curiously pauses for the years 1861 to 1865. And not just because there was a lot going on at that time, although there obviously was. The Native Americans were very much involved in the Civil War. Guess which side they fought for? Yeah, you won't read much about this in the textbooks either, but 10 Native American tribes sided with the Southern Confederacy, including some big names like the Cherokee, Choctaw, Seminole, and Comanche. But this is despite the fact that some of these tribes did not practice slavery, and the ones who did had a comparatively tiny population of African slaves. This reality is enshrined by the fact that the very last Confederate troops to surrender were Cherokee, and yet there's curiously no effort underway to cancel or remove icons commemorating these tribes, despite their very blatant support for the Southern Confederacy. So, why did the Native Americans take up the Confederate cause? Could it be they had their own reasons other than slavery? Now, it is worth mentioning the very unsettling fact that had the Southern states not seceded, then slavery would have continued well past 1865 in this country. And so, if we find slavery to be an abominable practice that needed to be ended as soon as possible, well then we find ourselves having to applaud the secession of the Southern slave states. This is not to say the South seceded to end slavery, of course not. But the practical effect of their leaving brought about a quicker end to slavery. Had they not seceded, slavery undoubtedly continues for a few more decades, potentially into the 20th century even. And so, the bitter irony is that if you abhor slavery, then you must grudgingly celebrate the Southern states' decision to leave the Union. Strange bedfellows, indeed. And so, getting back to this myth that the Civil War was only about slavery, I commend my colleagues on this stage in advance for taking up such a Herculean task. I for one would hate to have to argue that the Civil War was about slavery in the midst of such horrendously inconvenient truths. I expect that we will hear from them a few nice quotes from Lincoln, as opposed to the not-so-heroic ones that I mentioned, or something about how the Civil War abolished slavery. So therefore, that must have been the main aim of the conflict. Except, of course, that the abolition of slavery was an effect of the Civil War, not a cause. Cause and effect are two distinctly different things. Just because the Civil War ended slavery does not mean that the Civil War was caused by slavery. This is like saying that if the Big Bang caused the planet Earth, then the planet Earth caused the Big Bang. It's illogical. Nobody else on this stage is likely to bring up any of the things I mentioned, and that is because they don't want to talk about such inconvenient truths. But neither will they be able to refute any of the facts I have mentioned so far tonight, because they are all true. My well-intended colleagues are likely to brush past some of my points in a sort of, well, yes, that's true, but besides that, again and again and again. It's as though you told your kids to do the dishes every day this week, and then at the end of the week they confidently stated, well, besides Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday, we did the dishes every day just like you said. I mean, can you imagine? Okay, we get it. Besides the fact that there were 4 slave states still in the Union, besides the fact that Lincoln specifically stated the war wasn't about slavery, besides the fact that even anti-slavery politicians in the Union were willing to ratify a constitutional amendment protecting slavery indefinitely, and despite the fact that the South still left the Union in spite of this offer, besides the fact that there were black Confederates and the South considered a wide-scale emancipation and arming of slaves to fight in their army. All the while, Lincoln is not emancipating hundreds of thousands of slaves within his own borders, despite the fact that the Native Americans have taken up the cause of the Southern Confederacy, despite very minimal interest in the institution of slavery. Yes, I concede, besides all of these things, if you remove all of these other details and hide them from view and suppress them, then yes, the Civil War is about slavery. I mean, either you did the dishes every day this week or you didn't. Either the Civil War is about slavery or it isn't, or it is about multiple issues, one of which could be slavery. I mean, could you imagine going to a mechanic and being told, well, besides the muffler, radiator, steering alignment, and that clunking sound you keep hearing, your car is perfectly fine? It's precisely the same logic, just boiled down at its simplest level. Except for all these exceptions, this here is the sole reason or explanation. So, what was the Civil War really about? Well, that's a damn good question, and it's a question we should start asking a lot more in this country. One of the issues was slavery. I'm sure we have consensus on this point at least. I mean that earnestly. There can be no denying that the practice of slavery was a hotly debated topic in the lead up to the Civil War, and it was a source of economic and political division between free states and slave states. And therefore, it does contribute to the outbreak of war between the states. However, this wasn't a moral or ethical debate between ardent abolitionists and masochistic slave owners. Abolitionists comprised a tiny minority of the population, and they could be found in both the North and the South. The debate over slavery was an economic one, argued between industrial tycoons and large agricultural interests about the type of economy our rapidly expanding country would have, agrarian or industrial. So, to the extent that slavery is a factor in the Civil War, it isn't a moral or ethical topic for the vast majority of the nation's business or political interests, but merely one of practicality. The North wanted to keep importing cheap immigrant labor, while the South wanted to retain its already imported slave labor. And I assure you, humanitarianism was in very short supply across the board. If the African slaves in the South were expendable, then the imported European labor in the North was downright disposable. This might be a good time to remind everyone that the slave trade ended in 1808, and that's, let's see, 53 years before the Civil War. And of course, it must be mentioned that slavery is listed as an issue in the Articles of Secession, among a whole host of issues. For instance, the Virginia Convention that voted for secession passed 14 separate resolutions, one of which was the retention of slavery. The second and likely the most important cause of the Civil War was the long-simmering issue of tariffs in this country. Now, this seems alien to us, but this was a time before taxes on income and capital gains, and so the nation funded its government mostly through tariffs on imported goods. So, tariffs, for all practical purposes, are like taxes. The northern industrial states were decisively pro-tariff because it protected their manufacturing interests against foreign imports, while the South was virulently opposed to these protective tariffs because it raised the cost of their imported European goods, as well as generated legitimate fears that other countries might respond with increased tariffs of their own, which would make it harder for agrarian interests to export their raw goods to foreign markets. This was a marquee issue for the southern states, and the balance of national politics continued to tilt steadily more towards the northern industrial interests instead of the southern agrarian interests. And southern opposition was rational and self-interested and quite vocal, as is the case in most matters of economics. I mean, the tariff of 1828 was literally called the Tariff of Abominations. That's how upset the Southerners were becoming. It led Andrew Jackson's Vice President John C. Calhoun to devise a political theory known as nullification, which argued that a state could declare a federal law null and void within its own borders if they found it unconstitutional. Now, to us, again, these concepts are so distant and dated that they sound downright foreign, but these were genuine issues that generated considerable discussion and debate at that time. I am not endorsing Calhoun's idea of nullification, but I am stating that this interpretation of states' rights and the balance of powers was not beyond defense at that time. The increased tariffs and the idea of nullification led to what became known as the Nullification Crisis of 1832, when a group of Southern stalwarts held a convention and declared the tariffs unconstitutional and threatened to secede from the Union. President Jackson ultimately compromised, and the tariffs were lowered, and in the end, nobody seceded. But again, here's a direct case a mere 3 decades before the outbreak of the Civil War, of the concept of states' rights, allowing the prospect of secession based on Southern opposition to tariffs, not slavery. This is especially relevant to the topic of the Civil War because Abraham Lincoln once billed himself as a Henry Clay tariff Whig and even stated in 1847, "Give us a protective tariff and we shall have the greatest nation on earth." So Lincoln is very much in the camp of the northern industrialists on the topic of tariffs, and his election to the presidency caused serious concern for Southerners. Not because he was opposed to slavery, but because he was so ardently pro-tariff. How do we know this? Well, because, as I mentioned earlier, Lincoln kept saying over and over again that he had no problem with slavery, and then he took direct action to guarantee the slave states' rights to practice slavery. So, logically speaking, what must have spooked the Southern states the most was their concern over Lincoln's staunchly pro-tariff positions, which ultimately is not surprising, because most wars are fought over issues of economics, taxes, and land. Kind of like another war of rebellion that took place in this country. A third and equally significant issue closely related to the topic of tariffs that absolutely contributed to the outbreak of the Civil War was the genuine ideological belief that states had a legitimate right to leave the Union if they so desired. This worldview was not only prevalent throughout the South, but also present in the North, as many politicians in the North were uncertain of what to do during the outbreak of the Civil War. Northern abolitionist Horace Greeley, a very admirable man by most counts, famously put forth in an editorial in his paper during the outbreak of the Civil War, "If the Cotton States shall become satisfied that they can do better out of the Union than in it, we insist on letting them go in peace. The right to secede may be a revolutionary one, but it exists nevertheless. And whenever a considerable section of our Union shall deliberately resolve to go out, we shall resist all coercive measures designed to keep it in. We hope never to live in a republic whereof one section is pinned to the residue by bayonets." I mean, here's an abolitionist arguing to allow the Southern states to secede, and he was hardly alone. A lot of political observers and individuals were content to let the seceding states depart on the grounds that they had the right to do so. I have a feeling these realities have been redacted from our textbooks, and maybe we should start to ask ourselves why these important details are curiously missing from our kids' textbooks. In addition to the three issues of slavery, tariffs, and the philosophical belief that states could leave at their own will, I will put forward a fourth and final major contributing factor to the Civil War, whilst conceding that there could be other factors as well. Though it may seem a bit pedestrian, I will argue that Lincoln's raising of federal troops was a significant enough catalyst to warrant its designation as a contributing cause of the Civil War. It's very important to remember that the Southern states did not secede all at once. The timeline is actually quite staggered. The Confederate states of South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas all seceded from the Union by February 1st, 1861. However, after the firing on Fort Sumter, Lincoln issued a call for 75,000 federal troops on April 15, 1861. This served as a catalyst that prompted the states of Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee to then secede and join with the Southern Confederacy within about 9 weeks. I recognize that 7 of the eventual 11 Confederate states had already seceded by the time of Lincoln's call for troops, but the states of Virginia, Tennessee, and North Carolina were crucial additions to the Southern Confederacy's viability as an entity because they also became the top 3 states in the Confederacy in terms of population. No offense to Arkansas, of course. By gaining Virginia, the Southern Confederacy also gained the support of some of its finest generals, including Robert E. Lee, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, Jeb Stuart, and George Pickett. And that is as close as I am getting to the topic of military history, a subject I loathe and am totally unqualified to discuss. Without these final 4 states, the Southern Confederacy would have likely struggled to survive for even a full calendar year. And thus, I do feel that Lincoln's call for troops exacerbated and further inflamed tensions between North and South, and that this decision does warrant its place as a significant contributing factor to the breakout of civil war, especially when we consider the legacy of the British quartering of troops in the colonies as a major grievance of the Founding Fathers. And so, this is where I find the slavery-only argument breaks down quite quickly, because a clinical scan of the outbreak of the war points to at least 4 major contributing factors. I hate to editorialize, but essentially we have a situation where Southern slave states are unhappy with Lincoln's election as president. They have what many at the time would call a legitimate belief that they can secede from the Union at any time. They have genuine long-term economic concerns over tariffs that nearly led to their earlier departure. And these concerns have only increased after Lincoln's victory, while also having concerns about slavery. But Lincoln then asserts over and over that he is not a threat to the institution of slavery, and that he has no desire to end its practice. Not only that, as discussed earlier, he has green-lighted and fast-tracked a constitutional amendment to guarantee the slave states' right to practice slavery indefinitely. And then they still left in spite of this. I abhor this practice, but if we had to assign a number to the issue of slavery in this whole topic, I'd say slavery was maybe 20 to 30% of the cause of the Civil War, and yet the dominant narrative would have us believe it constituted something like 90 to 100% of the entire conflict. When the annals of world history show us countless conflicts caused by multiple factors and almost never just one cause, it is essentially dogmatic thinking that would have you believe a mythology that the Civil War would only have one primary cause. Now, as important as it is to challenge and dispel this mythology, it is just as important to understand how and why it got here in the first place. After all, dogmas and ideologies typically don't arise by accident, and this is no exception. And just as the Civil War had multiple contributing causes and not just one, the feel-good fable we have constructed and propagandized to the point of total saturation also has multiple causes. The first of which was a gradual shift of the narrative brought about by attention-seeking academics, publishing materials with fewer and fewer facts and increasing levels of editorialization so as to sell books and earn spots on TV talk shows that nobody watches. You know the ones. I mean, every industry has bad actors, and I think that all of us on this stage will likely agree that academia is no exception, present company excluded, of course. And to this point, I must add that this slavery-only version of the Civil War was not always the prevailing way of teaching the conflict in this country. For decades, the Civil War was better taught in this country as being a complex affair brought about by multiple issues and with good and bad on both sides. But I find it curious that the more removed we have gotten from the actual events, the more off the rails and hyperbolic, and dare I say, the more politicized the teaching of this event has gotten. If you don't believe me that self-interested bad actors can shift a narrative on a topic over time, then I'll take this moment to point out that at this very time there is a small movement of academics who are pushing a revisionist dogma that the Texas Revolutionary War was about slavery as well. Now, I am not a Texan, so I do not wish to thrust us into unexpected waters that I am not familiar with, but I have colleagues in Texas who have pointed to a few books that are pushing a new narrative and attempting to distort the cause of the leaders of the Texas Revolution. And so, I wouldn't be surprised if in 30 years, children in that state will be indoctrinated with an ever-shifting narrative on that topic as well, just as has happened with the Civil War. I do find it curious how in this country, if a rebellious movement is victorious, we call them revolutions, but if they fail, we simply call them rebellions or insurrections, as though they aren't all extremely similar, just like fees aren't taxes, right? The second cause of this shift in narrative is a very common element in human psychology that can, of course, be transferred from individuals to society writ large. And this tendency is called proportionality bias, also known as major event, major cause bias. In simple terms, it is the tendency to believe that big events must have correspondingly big causes. And the Civil War is a big event that had a catastrophic death toll and wreaked incredible havoc upon this country. So, it is only natural for us to dream up a big cause to go along with such a big event. And when you factor in the 600K or more deaths spread across 4 brutal years, the specter of brother fighting against brother, of houses divided, so to speak, we long and hope for a noble cause to accommodate such a painful time. And so, in the post-civil rights period, which spawned a movement, we'll call it, for what they call social justice, it isn't really all that surprising that this revisionist dogma chose to make slavery the all-inclusive issue for a complex and complicated affair. And for those of you who might counter me here and assert, well, surely all big wars with high body counts were caused by important moral issues. I'm sorry, the answer is no. You've fallen for the proportionality bias. Remember World War I? What was that caused by? Some Serbs assassinating a guy, some entangling alliances, and then the mobilization of one nation's army led to a global conflict that cost 20 million lives. We Americans joined in that conflict at the cost of more than 100K of our own. And I assure you, there was no great moral cause for that conflict. And then there are the Napoleonic Wars, the War of 1812, countless wars of succession in monarchical countries, and most recently, the war in Iraq, which was conducted under the guise of the ever-elusive weapons of mass destruction which still haven't turned up. There are always reasons and causes for conflicts throughout history, but they often aren't contests of lopsided morality. And to give in to this proportionality bias runs the risk of sensationalizing and moralizing that which should not be, to create false angels and false demons, both of which are very dangerous errors. After all, if we start to see angels and demons where there are none, we may lose our ability to see them where they actually are. And so, this self-indulgent effort to make this country's most painful conflict an epic showdown between black and white, of good versus evil, of angels versus demons, is not just egregiously incorrect, it is downright dangerous. I have tried to keep my personal emotions out of this conversation, but I am genuinely shaken by the vitriolic and hyperbolic comments made about Confederate leaders like Jefferson Davis and even Robert E. Lee in recent years, with some people calling them monsters. Genghis Khan, Attila the Hun, the dark minds behind the Third Reich, etc. Psychotic mass killers. Those are monsters, not self-interested Southerners who came up short. Conversely, pedestalizing Lincoln and the Northern cause is similarly disconcerting because it robs us of an opportunity to learn from and even admire the Union's ability to overcome their own moral shortcomings to emerge victorious and abolish slavery. Rather than reimagine Lincoln as some sort of false angel, I find it far more compelling and inspiring to know that it was a racist white man who was completely indifferent to the institution of slavery who managed to summon the strength and moral clarity to end that practice forever in this land. Similarly, I find it quite valuable that in this world of immense suffering, as history is practically an unending sequence of painful events, that something as morally ambiguous and yet incredibly painful as the Civil War can have a very good result come from it, that being the abolition of slavery. But calling people you don't like alive or dead monsters is a quick trip to the dehumanization of those with whom you disagree. You see how quickly we can succumb to extremism and moral absolutism. The Third Reich did it in the name of racial purity, and now we are doing it in the name of racial equity. But it makes no difference. It is still zealotry of the kind that allows no space for nuance, context, or shades of gray. It leads to violence and destruction. And so these iconoclasts who pound their chests and scream their moral superiority should take note that they are following in the footsteps of some of the world's most dangerous zealots that have repeatedly brought about immense suffering. Good company, indeed. The third reason we have concocted and clung so desperately to this mythology of the Civil War is perhaps the most unsettling to hear because it involves examining what the Confederates actually did as opposed to just screaming the word traitors over and over again. I mean, heaven forbid we actually take a look at their actions within the context of the American story, which is the topic of this evening's seminar. So, what did these so-called traitors do? Well, let's start with what they didn't do. Well, they didn't exactly sell nuclear secrets to the Chinese. South Carolina, the first state to secede, did not enter into an agreement to restore the British Empire's claim to the southern states, nor did Louisiana make any real effort to bring the French back. Texas did not join with Mexico. So, for starters, we throw this term traitor around far too cheaply. Frankly, I reject the notion that that is the proper term for the Southern Confederates. They did not betray this country or sell it out to a foreign power, so what did they do? Well, the state legislatures of the 11 Confederate states assembled together, deliberated, and voted to leave the Union and form their own nation. Oh boy, where have we heard this story before? Yes, all 11 Confederate states practiced slavery when they declared their independence, as did all 13 colonies when they seceded from Britain. Or do I have that language switched? You see how it's just a game of semantic favoritism. There was no legal precedent or stipulation that said the Confederate states could not secede from the Union, and the only means of compelling them to remain in the Union was by force. The Founding Fathers were loyal subjects to the Crown, and thus had far less legal ground to stand on than the Confederates did. Therefore, why wouldn't the Confederates believe they had the right to leave and form their own country? People expressed shock and dismay by the Southerners' decision to secede, as though it was an unfathomable and indefensible course of action. And yet the very first words of our Declaration of Independence say, when, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, followed shortly after by, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. The Southern states simply borrowed the playbook of our own founding fathers, and so the Southern Confederacy was forced against its will to rejoin the Union by sheer strength of arms, just as the colonies were attacked by the British Crown, except this time the Union was successful where the British were not. And so the nation founded by armed rebellion in the name of self-determination forcibly denied and suppressed the same type of effort by its own citizens within 100 years of its own creation, despite having zero legal grounds to do so. Perhaps now you can see our eternal problem. America is a nation founded on a false premise. We are a nation defined by treasonous rebellion that cannot tolerate its own treasonous rebels. There are a lot of people these days saying that this country does not celebrate traitors. Yes, we do. Every day. They're on our money. We've named countless cities, buildings, and schools after them. We've erected monuments to them, praising them for taking the side of treason. But then we somehow simultaneously forsake those who came afterwards and attempted to do the same thing, but not to ultimate success. None of this is to embrace or condemn either the Founding Fathers or the Southern Confederacy. In no way, shape, or form am I attempting to do either. I am just declaring what nobody else wishes to state anymore, that our nation's history and heritage are ultimately defined by hypocrisy. At our very core, we are a hypocritical nation. How else could we erect monuments to George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, both of whom were Southern slave owners who committed treason against their country in the name of rebellion, and then also erect a monument to Abraham Lincoln, a man who quelled rebellion by force, and all within 3 miles of each other? If King George III is truly a tyrant, how on earth is Lincoln not as well? The Union became what it had originally sought to avoid and oppose, and there's a massive life lesson leering back at us in that we might one day become just like our opponents of yesterday. People look at the firing on Fort Sumter as though it's a preposterous action, yet we praise a bunch of rabble-rousers for dressing up like Native Americans and throwing tea into the Boston Harbor. We are incapable of entertaining the possibility that the Southern Confederacy might have had a legitimate right to leave the Union over issues of tariffs and the mobilization of troops, but we take as gospel and revere the actions of the Founding Fathers who did the exact same thing over taxes and the quartering of troops. This is a country that lionizes men who took up arms and committed acts of physical violence against tax collectors, and now it puts people in jail for failure to pay taxes. Do not misunderstand me. I have tremendous respect for our Founding Fathers, but in hindsight, perhaps they should have considered the possibility that armed rebellion and treason against your current country is a tricky way to form a new country, because you run the risk that your own people might do it to you down the road. And so, it's the height of absurdity to be aghast at the Southern Confederacy and gawk in horror with some sort of forced moral outrage that they had the gall to replicate what our own founders did. Further, I find it disingenuous to smugly assert that neither of us would have done something similar if we were presented with such an opportunity and in the same circumstances. We can't even begin to imagine the difficult position Americans found themselves in when their home states left the Union to form a new country, and they had to choose between two sides with no clear legal directives, families torn apart by allegiances, and not sure who would prevail in the end. I mean, if the federal government sued your family, your spouse even, would you automatically side with the federal government over your own family? I think the universe merely collected a karmic debt from this nation when it was forced to pay the price for creating itself in such a manner by beating back its very own rebellion. Is there not some interesting truth to be reflected upon when we observe that the very act that made this country nearly unmade it too? And what are we to make of the Confederate States, their leaders, and their citizens? After all, we forced them to rejoin the Union and to become citizens of our nation once more. So why are we forsaking them, implicitly casting them into historical hellfire for eternity? North Carolina was North Carolina as a colony, a state in the Union, then a state in the Confederacy, and is again back in the Union. If we are canceling and disowning the Southern Confederacy, why did we fight to keep those states and their citizens, but also their leadership, I could rattle off a whole list of Confederate leaders who served in elected positions in the U.S. government and even the U.S. Army before and after the Civil War. These attempts to condemn the Confederacy in absolute terms are a direct rejection of President Lincoln's aims for reconciliation and everything the Union Army fought for. You see, this country has become that arrogant and intoxicated person at the party of the world, the one who can throw out insults at everyone else, but as soon as one person comes along and claps back, we crumble and call it unfair. We all know somebody like this, and if we don't, it's because we're that person. It's okay when we declare independence on our terms and we win, but as soon as someone else does it to us, it's completely unacceptable. And now it's the virtuous thing to suppress rebellion because it suddenly suits our interests at that particular moment. I mean, if you want to, you can look up correspondence and conversations between Union diplomats and ambassadors and their British counterparts. The British laughed at the Union's disgust with the Southern Rebellion, finding it the height of hypocrisy, pointing out how the former colonies were following in the British Crown's own footsteps by rejecting the Confederacy's rebellion through strength of arms. And if we truly were a nation interested in telling the truth, the sort of nation that makes its citizens swear in a court of law to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help me God, then we would include some of this correspondence in our history textbooks to maybe open our eyes to the complexity of human affairs and the potential for all of us to contradict ourselves or find ourselves on both sides of a particular issue. But you won't find a morsel of self-awareness in the pages of this selective drivel being spoon-fed to our children nationwide. It is a very unsettling thing, but the truth often is unsettling. We are a nation devoid of any self-awareness, and that is why we have insisted on perpetrating this myth that the Civil War was all about slavery. Because we can swallow this colossal bit of hypocrisy, of complete and total self-contradiction in our very own story, if we can somehow make the Civil War be about a moral cause like slavery. It goes down easier if you just say, yes, but those guys were the bad guys, so it's okay. You can overlook and ignore and, dare I say, even celebrate and praise what is a horrific inconsistency in the founding and preservation of this country if we unfairly demonize the losers and unfairly praise the victors of the Civil War. And we have done exactly that by conjuring up a lofty cause. Because otherwise, we do live in a world where might makes right, where if you can win, you have the moral mandate and high ground. And given the successes, some temporal and others more lasting, that some regimes have had over the years, like, say, the Mongols, the Huns, the Bolsheviks, the Third Reich, and so on, we should feel very, very reluctant to adopt this viewpoint that success proves morality, because then things get real dicey, real fast. Please understand that I mean these words with the utmost earnestness. I do not hold it against anyone who opts to ignore all of these inconvenient truths, who chooses to look away from the catastrophic fraudulence of this country's origins, and continues to believe the slavery-only myth as a justification for the Civil War and the elimination of a state's right to secede in a nation defined by rebellion. It is easier and more comfortable, but there is a price to pay for that comfort, and it is the gradual erosion of our collective intellect and self-awareness. I don't find it shocking at all that we have morphed into a bloated and bumbling superstate that inserts itself into everyone else's affairs, often to great suffering by others, while we completely neglect to tend to matters at home and completely ignorant about our own history. A people constantly assaulting the splinter in our neighbor's eyes, but utterly clueless about the one in ours. That is not to say that we haven't been a great nation or that we can't become one again, but a nation that believes itself to have always been right, and that tolerates its own blatant self-contradictions by manufacturing false myths will almost always degenerate into a self-righteous hypocrisy. It is what the decline of empires is made of. See, until we Americans begin to grapple with our own self-contradictions and the complexity of our own affairs without fabricating false moral causes to justify our actions, I don't think this country is going to be a serious country, certainly not a country that others take seriously. We will continue to lick invisible wounds, wave countless bloody shirts in perpetuity, smearing the legacies of the deceased who cannot defend themselves, and then claim some sort of moral victory. The sort of country that scores own goals on itself and thinks it's winning. I promised my students I'd use a sports metaphor, so there you go. Listen, I don't blame you for believing the comic book, the fairy tale that the Confederates were demons in gray uniforms, that the saintly Abraham Lincoln slew the big bad Jefferson Davis, and that all was right again in the realm. that the victors can never be wrong and the losers can never be right. It makes it easier to sleep at night. We all have the right to be wrong. It's a right I assure you I have taken advantage of myself plenty of times, and I'm sure I will again. And so, if you are one who likes the direction this country seems to be heading, a nation that is constantly at odds with its own history, a country that imagines ghosts and is plagued by self-loathing, a nation of silly people who invent their own truths and wage wars on dead people, of iconoclastic zealotry that cannot allow for objective self-analysis without the knee-jerk assertion of some sort of race-based dogma, then by all means let's continue on the road we're headed. And I'm sure most of you can tell by my words this evening that I am very much against the recent flare-up of self-righteous angst that has led to the undemocratic removal of so many statues and icons. But I must state quite clearly that the most extreme of those partisans are at least ideologically consistent. We cannot cancel Robert E. Lee without also canceling Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. We cannot praise Lincoln and Grant while also condemning the British Crown. We cannot forsake the Confederacy and also revere the Continental Congress. We cannot applaud Sherman's March to the Sea and also celebrate the 4th of July. And so, as opposed as I am to all of these childish outbursts masquerading as heroism, the ones who clamor to remove all of the statues and monuments and rename all of the schools are at least ideologically consistent. If you want to start removing some, very soon you're going to have to remove them all. But I suspect there may be some of you here this evening who are open to this conversation, who are open to understanding the hard truth. And to those of you, I say, welcome to the club. Unfortunately, it's not a very big one. I know we're going to hear from my colleagues on this stage here shortly, but I wanted to close my opening remarks with a more contemporary reference. It may seem a bit out of place, but I found it so poignant and universally applicable that I could not resist reading it tonight. A good academic always discloses his sources, and so I'd like to read one of the final excerpts from the TV show Chernobyl. We're on dangerous ground right now because of our secrets and our lies. They are practically what defines us. When the truth offends, we lie and lie until we cannot even remember it's there, but it is still there. Every lie we tell incurs a debt to the truth. Sooner or later, the debt is paid. Given the severely divided state of our country, I doubt I need to tell you what price we will pay for failing to grapple with the truth about the Civil War, and for our intentional suppression of the truths that we found inconvenient. Just like the national deficit, the intellectual debt we keep accruing to the truth will come due. I am not in the conversion business. I am not peddling a course or a book. This is not a personal crusade for me. I am well aware that all empires collapse eventually, and I am not arrogant enough to think that it is my job to save this country. Either the country will save itself or it won't. I just came to tell the truth, because it's about damn time someone did. I only ask that some of you join me in doing the same. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this video, please press the like button and subscribe. Seriously. It will help the algorithm spread the message. Thank you.